All right, let's talk a little bit about immigration. This was a good idea. Jacob had this idea. Um, and if you notice, immigration generally plays into a lot of these questions. If it's not the entire question, it is a factor and something that you can oftentimes discuss. So it's good to have a good working knowledge of this. Now, obviously, the United States is a nation of immigrants. During colonial days, everybody except for Native Americans came from somewhere else. And they usually came here to escape religious persecution, an opportunity. Maybe they just had a bit of an adventurous spirit. Something brought them here. Maybe they just wanted to kind of do their own thing. Well, anybody that came over here was indeed a immigrant. Now that also was slaves who came over there against their will, captured and shipped over, and then sold off to an owner. They indeed were immigrants, so they were some of the first. Indentured servants who came over here, they couldn't afford passage, so they basically put themselves into slavery status, and then they worked off their debt, and then they were given their freedom. Now, the first factories, those factories in the Northeast, those textile mills, those usually were run by a lot of lot of immigrants because they would take less and they would work for less. Women waiting to be married generally tended to be workers. Again, they would take less, and immigrants, they would take less, which we're going to talk about creates a little resentment. Now, things like the gold rush, because of who the people that were coming over, what these immigrants were. Usually they were younger, usually they were single, and usually they were seeking to improve their lives. So usually they were game for a little bit of adventure, things like the gold rush where they felt like they could go make some money quick. They were all about those kinds of things. Now, in the 1800s, this is when the really big explosion of immigration happens. And the first wave we call the old immigrants. These are immigrants from like Great Britain, from France. These are seen as the good immigrants, the immigrants that we really want. They're from very good stock. A lot of people that are here already in the United States who don't consider themselves immigrants usually have a background from France or Great Britain, so they're like, hey, they're one of us. They feel very comfortable. These are good quality people. We'll bring them over. Now, as we move through the 1800s, we start to get immigrants from other places. The new immigrants, those are people that came from Southern and Eastern Europe, like Russians and Slavs and all the Germans and Irish. We consider these lower stock. These are kind of the barbarians. Like, they're going to bring some bad element into the United States. So there's some resentment towards these people. We're going to talk about that in a little while. Now, usually the first place you went is you went to cities. And immigrants tended to live amongst themselves. Now, that doesn't mean entirely, like if I settled in a neighborhood with other Italians, that doesn't mean like the neighborhood was all Italian. But there usually was a pretty strong concentration of Italian people there. So they did that for a lot of reasons. One, because it was comfortable. It almost felt like home. So if I lived in a neighborhood like a Little Italy, and I'm Italian, then there's restaurants that have Italian food. People spoke Italian, maybe out in the open a little bit more. Maybe there was even newspapers and other materials that were printed in Italian. They might have had parades and festivals that had to do with like Italian traditions. And you can sub in other ethnic backgrounds. This happened in the German parts of town. They would just do it for German traditions. But this brought a lot of like, whatever that country was, it brought a lot of those traditions into the United States and made people feel comfortable. Now, like I said, in the Little Italies, in like the German towns, there was definitely people from other ethnic backgrounds. It wasn't like only Italians lived there. Now, I'd say one exception is like Chinatowns. Chinatowns were pretty predominantly Asian. And that was because there was a pretty gigantic resentment. Asian Americans probably got the worst of the discrimination. And they were kind of quarantined off into their own area. So that wasn't really by choice. That was more by kind of function. Now, what brought immigrants here? There was a lot of reasons. There was a lot of push factors, meaning things that pushed them out of their homelands. We talked about how there was overcrowding in a lot of European countries. So that was one of those things like, where do I go? Where do I live? Like, it's just so crowded here. I want to go move somewhere else. There was, again, religious persecution. The Jews moved to the United States from like Russia and other areas because they were getting persecuted for their religion, their beliefs. A lot of people came to the United States for opportunity. we'll talk about that in a minute. That's pull factor. A lot of people came to the United States because of a bad incident, like the potato famine in Ireland, or in China they had the Opium Wars in the late 1800s, and a lot of like Chinese farmers lost their land. So a lot of things were pushing like these immigrants to the United States. Now there were a lot of pull factors, like I mentioned, land. There was a lot of westward expansion in the United States that literally they were giving land away. So, Europeans heard about this, or Asians or whoever, saying, hey, out west in the United States and Oklahoma and other states, they're literally giving land to people. I have nothing in my home country, and this is a country that's literally giving land to people as they get off the boat. So they wanted to come to the United States for land opportunities. Jobs, they knew they were jobs. And a lot of times contractors would come to these European countries, and they would sell people like, hey, there's opportunities in the United States. Come to the United States. You're going to make money. You're going to do big things. These contractors would take a percentage of the earnings of each of these immigrants. So when all was said and done, the contractor probably didn't give a really accurate description of what the immigrant would make. They made it sound like these factories were going to pay them like big dollars and they were going to be, independently wealthy within the year, and that wasn't the case. You generally pay and working conditions were a lot worse than what they were made aware of. And like I said, contractors also took a part of their small wages, so it wasn't necessarily the rosy picture that was painted. Now, industrialization creates a lot of this, a lot of the factory jobs. So again, this is going to lead a lot of immigrants to the United States. Now, when they get off the boat, like I mentioned, first, usually they come into a big city. So the ports are going to lead them into like a Boston or a New York or Galveston, Texas, or some sort of big port that they're going to kind of stop, and this is where the location is. A lot of these people didn't necessarily have a lot of contacts within the country. Maybe they had a few family members, some cousins, and they might go live with them or made arrangements to kind of stay with them initially. But party bosses would oftentimes find these immigrants, and they would say like, hey, I got a job for you. I got a room that you can rent. Just kind of come with me. And these party bosses would get them employment, get them housing. Now, obviously, they'd want something in return. They'd want them to vote for their political party come election time. Party bosses would also try to solve any problems the immigrants would have. Let's just say one night I ran a little bit, followed the law, and I've got some legal trouble. So I'd go to the party boss, and the party boss might lean on his connections with the police department saying, Scotty's pretty good, let him go. He just had a bad night. And then the police might say, okay. And that would further connect me to that party boss. So now literally I'm really owe him something. So when election time came, I did not dare to cross them because, again, all of a sudden that legal trouble could reemerge. My house could go, or my housing could go away. My job could go away. And all of a sudden I'm in some dire straits. So it was a corrupt system that really took advantage of immigrants. Obviously the party bosses did help and they got jobs and the housing, but you had this kind of indentured almost kind of feeling towards those party bosses. Wasn't necessarily good. Immigrants were big in westward expansion, like I mentioned, giving land away, this idea of manifest destiny. When opportunities maybe when they realized these factory jobs didn't pay a ton, city life was maybe exciting. There were things to do, but it was also poor conditions in the housing. They thought they'd maybe try their luck out west, so a lot of people did drift to the Oklahomas and other areas. Railroads were extremely reliant on the different immigrants. Asian Americans in particular were extremely instrumental for building railroads out west. Without them, it would have taken obviously a lot longer. I can't say it never would have gotten done. I'm sure somebody would have done it, but clearly they were really, really helpful in building railroads. Like we mentioned, railroads were instrumental in industrialization. So industrialization was sparked by the creation of railroads and getting products from place to place, different markets. Now, industrialization was also spurred along by the factories producing mass amount of products because they had this cheap labor from this steady immigration pool that was coming in. So a lot of times government policy was really, really lenient about letting people in. Knowing full well these immigrants were, building the railroads and working in the factories, and they were responsible for building up our nation's infrastructure. They allowed some really lenient immigration policies to let this flow of immigrants kind of come in. Now, immigrants, like I mentioned, lived kind of usually in a part of the city where they kind of concentrated amongst people from their home country, and a lot of these factories, a lot of the cuisine, a lot of parades and festivals that pop up, all kind of contribute to kind of a diversifying culture like that's happening in the United States. So it's kind of a big deal. In the cities, they had things like settlement houses, Jane Addams and Hull House. This was a big deal. They really helped immigrants get settled. They helped immigrants find employment, learn English, learn how Americans kind of did things, so American customs, so they taught classes. They helped them find places to live. If they were down on their luck, maybe they would, provide like soup or other like meals. Now, unlike party bosses, they didn't do things to get them out of trouble, or they didn't expect anything in return. So this was clearly more of a charitable endeavor than party bosses who like found this as a way to tie you to their interest. A lot of immigrants saw education as their way out of poverty. They wanted their kids to be educated so they could take a step. Now, this wasn't always possible because during the late 1800s, a lot of times immigrants needed the income from kids. So kids had to work like adults, working like an adult work week, not allowing them to go to school. But those that had the opportunity, they really kind of pushed education on their kids. That was the way to do it. Like I mentioned, factory work wasn't necessarily always the best, not always the most sanitary, not always the most safe, not always the best pay. And the fact that immigrants would work for less created much, much resentment among those non-immigrants. And they started to resent those people that were coming over. So that resentment kind of plays out. And probably the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti best describes the bigotry of towards immigrants. These were two immigrants that were pretty radical in nature, but they were accused of something they did not do and eventually executed for it, even though they had some other gang that kind of basically said, like, hey, we did it. They admitted it, yet everybody just wanted to believe that these immigrants did it, and that wasn't really a good thing. So we had all kinds of things like the Immigration Restriction League that was pushing the government to like, hey, let's restrict immigration. Let's stop immigrants from coming in. They're bad news. So the resentment not only was, hey, they're lowering pay, but they're also that they're taking jobs from Americans. They also blame them. And again, remember, these are a lot of the new immigrants. So they're not the British and the French or the Protestant religion, but there are a lot of Catholics and Greeks and Russian Orthodox religion. And so they didn't like their religion. They didn't like their ethnic background. They thought they brought bad customs in, like the Irish and the Germans especially, that had a big tradition with alcohol. Like there were a lot of the brewers and winemakers, and they're like, see, they're bringing all this bad stuff in. Alcohol's on the rise because of them, because of the immigrants. And this is why lower productivity, like this is why domestic abuse is happening and child abuse and all of these things. So they're kind of blaming them, the overcrowding of the cities. They thought that, again, they didn't speak English, so they're not contributing anything to this, to American society. They thought that they were going to support their homeland, not support the United States, but where I came from, Germany or Italy or wherever I came from. So they thought that there was just this growing bigotry towards immigrants. And in the early 1900s, we start to see that we really want to shut this down, particularly after World War I in 19, when we go to World War I, 1917, when we're done with that, there's really going to be a move towards, like, let's limit the amount of immigrants. So we start restricting the numbers that we take, trying to find out where they're from. Asians really get hit the worst, and that we really kind of shut down immigration from Japan. And then during World War II, we've got the incident with Asian Americans in the concentration camps, where we take Asian Americans from their homes and put them in the internment camps. Again, they weren't treated like the Jews were in the Holocaust, but, anytime you take away somebody's freedom, that's a bad thing. Korematsu versus United States, a Supreme Court case where the Japanese American Fred Korematsu sued, and the U.S. Supreme Court said it's okay. We're protecting our national security. That's why it's okay to do.